For our psalm reading this week, I've selected Psalm 39. So could I get someone to read Psalm 39 to the class?
I'm glad to read.
Go ahead.
Psalm 39, I have the New International Version. I said, I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth as long as the wicked are in my presence. But when I was silent and still, not even saying anything good, my anguish increased. My heart grew hot within me, and as I meditated, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Show me, O Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting is my life. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Each man's life is but a breath. Man is a mere phantom as he goes to and fro. He bustles about, but only in vain. He heaps up wealth, not knowing who will get it. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of fools. I was silent, I would not open my mouth, for you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I am overcome by the blow of your hand. You rebuke and discipline men for their sin. You consume their wealth like a moth. Each man is but a breath. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. For I dwell with you as an alien, a stranger as all my fathers were. Look away from me that I may rejoice again before I depart and am no more.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start with the first section, verses 1 through 3. Actually, first I'll start off with just a kind of a side note and a question. I've said in maybe a few previous weeks, maybe last week, that these Psalms of David, they could have been composed by David. They could have been composed by one of his descendants. They could have been composed for David or for one of his descendants. I have not been able to find any commentaries that specifically weigh in on the question of who composed this psalm, but I was just curious to see if there are any people who notice things in the psalm that might indicate or might give clues on who it might have been written by.
It sounds like Solomon a little bit in his vanity of vanities that he expressed in Ecclesiastes.
Sure, that's an interesting idea, and I noticed that as well in the middle section. Yeah. We usually skip the subtitle of the psalm, which is part of the Hebrew text. This one says, to the choir master, to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. And if anybody's familiar, Jeduthun is one of the, well, he's the choir master that that David appointed in I think, I don't know which I think First Chronicles. So there's some argument to be made that the composition of this psalm was for David or during his reign or shortly after, because of the mention here. That's just kind of my own I don't know, observation. Okay, so in verses 1 through 3, What sort of situation do we find the psalmist in?
He seems disturbed about something.
Yeah. Go on.
Well, it seems like he's very frustrated. He wants to say something to somebody, but he doesn't do it, and he's kind of instead of he's holding it in.
I kind of wonder if he's trying to restrain himself from arguing, because he says about that there are wicked in my presence, and so I'm being quiet. And it seems to me that maybe he's trying to show a little restraint and not have a verbal argument.
I'm kind of reminded of the proverb here. I think Mark Twain kind of made a humorous paraphrase of, where the proverb says something to the effect of, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise, and I wonder if Dave is just trying to keep his mouth shut to stay out of trouble.
Right. He has something to say. He has something he says, I'm mused and the fire burned. So he's got something that's really, really bothering him. But if he says it, he's afraid that the wicked will hear it.
Maybe it's what he's going to say is what is in verses 4, 5, 6, 7, that he wanted to say something to God like, this doesn't seem like you've given any guarantees here, or you've been fair in making my life, because it's all fleeting. And maybe he doesn't want to let the wicked hear it, or they might not believe in God. But one possibility.
Yeah. Or they might have grounds to accuse him of something. So let's move on to his words. In verses 4 through 6, what's he talking about? You mentioned Ecclesiastes earlier. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. You're up there as Cindy, but I know that's probably your wife.
BJ.
BJ. Okay, BJ. You mentioned Ecclesiastes. This sounds very well, not ecclesiastical, but it sounds very much like something out of Ecclesiastes. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I was thinking he was just kind of pondering his own mortality. I mean, he says it several different ways. My life's end, number my days fleeting. It's like a handbreadth, it's a breath, it's a phantom. So he's just really pondering his own mortality.
It almost sounds like he's like trying to have the Lord convince him or remind him of his immortality. For some reason, it's like he's like asking the Lord to humble him or something. I can't really tell.
Yeah. Right. He does. Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's correct. And not only mortality, but what else? What I mean, what does if there are similarities here to what Ecclesiastes talks about, what else does he here? What else is he talking about?
There's a certain confusion.
Okay.
On or off? On. I mean, he says, surely all mankind stands as mere breath. Surely man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing, they are all in turmoil. I get the sense of the congregation, the people listening to this psalm, they are in confusion. At least that's what I'm feeling about it.
Well, in verse 6, my translation uses this idea that, people bustle about, but only in vain. And of course, in Ecclesiastes, it's vanity, vanity. And then the whole thing about he heaps up wealth, but not knowing who will get it. Again, kind of the fleeting nature of, the temporary nature of wealth, which is another theme in Ecclesiastes.
Right. So there's this futility, and a couple people have mentioned the mere breath or vanity. The Hebrew word, I don't know if how many of you remember some sermons that Pastor Josh preached on Ecclesiastes. He talked about the Hebrew word hevel, which is translated in various ways as mere breath or vanity or a vapor or something. And that word hevel is used 3 times in this psalm. So there's, I don't know, if it, yet another similarity, Ecclesiastes, for those of you who are. Okay, so verse 7 and through verse 7 through 11, we have a transition in the psalmist's thought. What does he now turn to?
He turns to God.
Sure, and for what? What's his?
For forgiveness.
And he seems to be asking the Lord to kind of like remove his rebuke and discipline.
So the psalmist is suffering something, which is from God. And this is verses 10 through 11. Remove your stroke from me when you discipline a man with rebukes for sin. So how does his, let me ask this question. How does his how does his asking the Lord for forgiveness from his sins relate to his reflections in the previous 3 verses on mortality and futility, and then even maybe this whole situation in verses 1 through 3 where he's trying to keep quiet in the presence of the wicked? What's the connection between those things?
It could be the Old Testament thought that the psalmist's sins is going to shorten his life. In other words, it's a punishment from God, and he's going to lose his wealth, and he's going to die sooner. That maybe there was, God's blessing was very tangible in wealth, health, etc.
I think your answer to that question, basically, who's saying the psalm, who's the speaker is. If you determine it's A or B or C, you get different reactions.
Sure. How so?
Well, I'm personally reading it as though David is saying it. And David is concerned that he's going to die, but he wants God to forgive him before he dies.
Sure.
And that comes out clearly in the last two verses.
Sure. Now, let's turn to those last two. Gordon, could you paraphrase what he's saying?
That he's saying to God, forgive me, but do it before I die.
He even says, look away from me that I may smile again. So there's this, he speaks of the hostility of God's hand against him in verse 10. So what do we do with a psalm that ends like this? How do we interpret this? It's kind of a bleak ending, I think, at least.
Well, we know from the historical text that David didn't die, Bathsheba didn't die, the baby did die, which was a great blow to David, and furthermore, David had to face the rebellion in his own household. But things could have been a lot worse.
Other thoughts? How do we understand a prayer that ends with this sort of expression?
Well, I think the psalmist is trying to stress to the listeners the importance of their relationship with God, and that the temporal world isn't that important.
Sure.
It seems
maybe,
like. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe, as you said, that he's stressing the importance of a relationship with God, and that includes being very honest with him. He's really wishing, if God is putting this scourge on him, he's wishing that God would turn away and not be around. Maybe he's suggesting you too should be honest when you pour out your heart to God.
There's also Job. Job said, God will not leave me alone long enough to spit. He was feeling the presence of God in a negative way. And I think David was also feeling the presence of God in a negative way.
Kirsten, I think
I was thinking the widow that Elijah visited when her son died. She's like, what are you doing drawing God's attention to me? That's what came to my mind in reading these last couple verses when he says, look away from me. Like, God, don't pay too much attention to me. But maybe part of that is just kind of an acknowledgement of sin. I know I'm a sinner, so don't look at me because I'm in big trouble.
Yeah, it seems like he's kind of in a moment of intense distress. And so like the psalm is focused on that moment. Like, and so maybe things improve later. But like Jeannie was saying, like he's in this moment where he like doesn't really want God to look at him, and that it just kind of encapsulates that moment.
I wonder in this time, and I can't really answer this, but I wonder how people thought about death and what comes after. I mean, I think, would have a pretty clear idea that this is what happens. But in the time of David, without, we've got a lot of scriptures that talk about, absent from the body, present with the Lord, things like that. But for David's time, I don't know that people had a lot of that. And I think maybe there's a little bit of anxiety about just what lies beyond the point of physical death. I mean, in the narrative, when his child dies, he says things like, well, I'll go to him, but he's not going to come to me, things like that. And it sounds like, does he really grasp what is in store after the end of this, physical life?
We were talking about the presence of God. In college, they told us that the Greeks, when they worshiped their gods and performed sacrifices on the altar, that when they cut the throat of the animal, they were trying to break the connection between them and their God. They did not think the attention of the gods was at all a good thing.
So a couple people, a couple of you said things that I also was thinking about when I said, Kirsten, this psalm captures a moment of distress, and BJ, the psalmist is being very, very honest with God, so honest that, looking back to the beginning of the psalm, he's afraid to say out loud what he has to say in the presence of the ungodly, because they might, maybe they're going to misconstrue his words as impiety. There's also, I think, a sense in this psalm of whatever's going on if it's David or another psalmist, whatever's going on in the psalmist's experience is it hasn't finished yet. He's praying a prayer that is in the midst of things, and there's a couple of psalms in the Psalter that are like this. Psalm 88, which isn't a psalm of David. It's one of my favorite psalms, but it ends very bleakly, and I think there's a lot of value in a psalm like this that gives voice to struggle and hard feelings toward God, but in real honesty, and I don't know. I wanted to do this psalm for that reason, partly just because it I don't know how I say it. I think it's really great that struggles that we go through, we pray in the midst of them, and they continue on. But we can go to these thousands of year old scriptures and find the faithful saying the same sorts of things. So that's just one last thing I wanted to say about that. I'd like to turn to our narrative now. So this is 2 Samuel 11 through 14. And first off, I'd just like to get a recap of all of the events that happened in this section of the narrative. So could I just get kind of a plot summary from a couple people? What happens first?
Well, it starts with David and Bathsheba. So he takes her and sleeps with her, and then she's pregnant. So he arranges for her husband to be killed, and then he takes her maybe more openly as his wife, and then Nathan confronts him with his sin.
And when Nathan confronts him, how does David respond?
Well, first, when he's just looking at it as a hypothetical, he says the man who did this should die.
Sure. So there's Nathan's parable that he tells.
Then David does recognize his own sin. Chapter 12, verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And so then David fasts and waits to see what happens until the child dies.
It's interesting that David perceives himself as being in touch with God to the extent that he feels he could change, that at least there's a chance that he could change God's mind.
Or perhaps he figures, well, why not hurt trying? This reminds me of the Ninevites in Jonah. From what we're told about them, they certainly can't claim a particular close relationship to the Lord. But when Jonah prophesies to them that, I can't remember yet 30 days or something like that, and Nineveh will be overthrown, they all put on sackcloth and ashes, and the kingdom of Nineveh says, well, who knows, maybe the Lord will yet relent. So could be David's relationship with the Lord, or it could be just, well, I might as well try. So what happens then? After David mourns, so the child does die.
And then David gets up and eats and starts going back to his normal routine again.
Sure, right. Okay, so that's David and Bathsheba. What I want to focus on is actually the second main section of this reading. So a couple people referred to this already. Beginning in chapter 13, what's happening? What happens?
So Amnon, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right.
Amnon, yeah.
Amnon, he becomes, he falls in love with and becomes pretty obsessed with Tamar. And so he pretends to be sick and rapes her. And then Absalom finds out and kills Amnon. So that's the beginning of that section.
Sure.
Well, there's an interesting statement from Absalom, which might have been just to cover his intentions. He said,
what is that? Okay, keep going.
He says to Tamar, don't be too upset. After all, he is your brother.
So why does Absalom say this to Tamar? I actually don't know which is the right way to pronounce it.
I don't know what kind of death, I don't remember what kind of death Absalom was planning for Amnon, but he didn't want Amnon to be on his guard.
Okay, so let's start with this. Absalom tells Tamar to hold her peace. So basically, don't say anything about this. Don't speak up. What would have happened if she did speak up about this?
Well, then if David would have found out about it, he would have done something, probably, assume.
Okay, so what exactly would he have done about it?
I think he would have made them get married.
Right, and this comes from where?
Deuteronomy.
Good. Do you have the exact passage?
No.
Okay, it's
unlike some people, I do not have Deuteronomy memorized.
No, I don't either. I had to look this up, in advance. But yes, it is from Deuteronomy. It's chapter 22, verses 28 through 29. So I'll just flip open to those.
Oh, you know who did have Deuteronomy memorized?
Yeah.
The Lord Jesus.
Okay, well. Okay, so Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Okay, so Absalom tells Tamar to keep quiet so that this doesn't happen. Why does he do that?
I think he's already plotting his revenge.
Yes.
And am I right to understand that Absalom and Tamar are full siblings, and then they're half siblings with Amnon? So
yep.
Same father, different mother.
Correct.
Which I can't imagine you're going to marry your half sister.
Well, so there's a question there. Is that too close? We actually do have one prominent couple who are half siblings earlier on in Scripture.
Abraham and Sarah.
Yep. So I don't know if there's a particular instance in the law, the Torah, where it says that's too close or it's far enough for a husband and wife to be. But we see Tamar's words to Amnon after the rape happens. when he says, "Get up, go," she says, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." So, and earlier on, before Amnon does this heinous act, she says, "Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." So Tamar at least assumes that if Amnon wants her, there are more proper ways to go about doing it, and that it would at least be legal for him to marry her. Okay, so we have Absalom. One other question about his behavior here: does he have Tamar's best interests in mind?
No.
Why not?
Well, because since she can't say anything, she feels that she is been kind of taking advantage of it, and it says that she's in despair. So she would have preferred to have been married to him, even though maybe she didn't really like him. I mean, we don't really know that.
Right.
Getting back to David, doesn't it say somewhere that David never said to any of his sons, "What are you doing?" I took that to mean that David did not discipline his sons, which could have led to the behavior of Amnon.
Okay, so let's talk about what David's doing in this section. We see him mentioned a few times. What's the first instance? Let's see. I'll find it actually. Verse 7. Thank you. David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So he interacts with Amnon a little bit. What's his role here? Go ahead.
Oh, David believes Amnon. Doesn't have any reason not to trust that he's not ill. Not to trust that he's ill, and he is just kind of the go-between here. So he asks Tamar to do what his brother asked.
Sure.
He actually doesn't ask Tamar to do it. He tells her to go.
Right.
And I think it reflects the position of women in this time and culture, right? Your father controlled you, and then your husband, and then your son. She has no choice in the matter, except if she could have gone to her father and said, "Amnon raped me, we need to be married." That's the only thing she's allowed to do. And her brother prevents her from doing that.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
I also think Amnon was David's oldest son. I think. I'm not certain. I believe he was.
Yeah, I think so too.
So he may have been a little bit of a favorite. Who knows?
Well, he's the heir at that point.
Well, in verse 21, David does hear about it. It says, when King David heard all of this, he was furious. But that's the only sentence. So he doesn't make anything happen. He's just angry.
Wait a minute. Wasn't Amnon eventually exiled for a while?
No, he wasn't.
Oh, who was the one who was exiled?
Absalom runs away after he kills Amnon. And then the other thing that David does, he's told that all of his sons have died. And then he said, no, that's not the case. And then verse 39, the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom. I mean, I think he wanted him back, even though he had done something wrong.
Let's look at go ahead.
I think that verse 21 is very interesting. So David did find out about the rape and everything, but he didn't do anything.
Why didn't he do anything?
I think maybe because of his own past, and also because Amnon may have been his favorite son at that point. I mean,
so the Message translation of verse 21, I mean, it's a paraphrase.
Sure.
King David heard the whole story and was enraged, but he didn't discipline Amnon. David doted on him because he was his firstborn.
Yeah, so that second phrase, he doted on Amnon, he may have, but that's not present in the text. I want to suggest something else.
Paraphrase.
Oh, sure, right. Yes. I'm not right. I'm not. Yeah, you're not wrong there. Yeah.
But I thought
I want to suggest
Gary's point about David didn't say anything because of David's own experience. How can I criticize my son for raping a woman when I did the same thing?
That's one possibility. I want to suggest that there's another possibility happening here. And it goes back to, Absalom telling Tamar to keep quiet about this. So if Tamar hasn't said anything, how does this story come to David in all likelihood?
Amnon tells him.
What?
Amnon tells him?
What? Amnon? Why would Amnon do that?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't know. Probably some servant. Maybe there's some gossip or something.
Right. It could be, right. It could be gossip. So the story gets back to David as gossip, unsubstantiated rumor. Tamar herself certainly hasn't come forward. And if David didn't know that Absalom had told her to keep quiet, he might think, well, why isn't Tamar saying anything? But it may be that what gets back, what David hears is this scandalous rumor, and since he has no idea whether it's true or false, he might feel that his hands are sort of tied. What can he do about it if it's just this unsubstantiated rumor? So that's another possibility. Oh, go ahead, Frank.
My understanding of the Old Testament courts was to do anything, even if you're dealing with a murderer, you have to have 2 eyewitnesses. Otherwise, it's no go.
Right. So there may be a reason why that may be the reason why Amnon sent out all of the men before he commits this act. Right.
You mean Absalom, don't you?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, Amnon.
Oh, right. The rape. Oh, okay.
Yes, correct. Okay, so now Absalom, he conspires to murder Amnon. And he's successful. So now in verse 14, Jeannie, as you said, now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. The Hebrew's actually a little bit vague here. His heart could be going out in longing or in kind of the opposite, but either could be possible from the grammar. So,
do you think that David thought it was the Lord's punishment? Because Nathan said that his family would be destroyed, so more or less.
Well, let's look at that. So Nathan's words to David, let's see. So chapter 12, verse 13, David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. So this is going back to Old Testament law. What happens to an adulterer? David has slept with a married woman. So the punishment for him would be death. So, but the Lord has put away the sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, or possibly the enemies of the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. So, so that raises a question: Is this all punishment for David's sin?
Well, didn't Nathan also say the sword will not depart from your house, and what you did in secret, I will do in public?
Right.
That's verse 11 and 12 of chapter 12.
Right. So what's that all about?
Well, Absalom was advised to make it clear that there was no going back to David, no reconciliation possible. And the way he did that was he put all David's wives and concubines on the roof, and then he had sex with all of them.
Sure. So we see the fulfillment of that prophecy in Absalom doing that during his coup. But I guess my question is, if death is David's punishment for committing adultery, what are all these other things that Nathan talks about? The sword will never depart from your house. The child will die. Are those extra punishments?
I mean, I think sometimes there's just natural consequences of our sin, right? It ripples out into other people, like when you drop a stone in a pond, it ripples out. And I'm thinking, depending on how well David's own behavior was known, that could have influenced what both Amnon and Absalom did. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. They're imitating what they've seen in their father.
Sure. Well, there's a couple ways that we see the apple not falling too far from the tree here.
Well,
Frank, you've sometimes how David's go ahead.
And David has, like, I don't know how many wives.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, he has like 6 or 8 families there going on. I mean,
sure.
That would drive me crazy.
Anyway, Frank, you've mentioned a number of times how David is a smooth operator.
Yeah.
So, what do we see here in chapters 13 and 14?
Well, I don't know about chapters 13 and 14, but certainly after David is driven out of Jerusalem and he's in the wilderness or wherever he was, that smooth operator comes right back. He becomes the military genius again. And like I said in a previous Sunday school session, he didn't leave Jerusalem until he had a priest with the Urim and the Thummim. So that's another aspect of who David is and what he does and how he does it.
Sure. So here's another question. What sort of man is Absalom? We'll see him more in next week's reading. But from what we've seen from his behavior thus far, what sort of man is he?
Stupid.
Stupid?
Anybody who thinks he can beat David at guerrilla war is really stupid.
Okay, but we haven't gotten to the war yet.
he's very, very vengeful. You know, he wants, and he's kind of ambitious.
Sure.
And yes, I see now, I think what you're driving at about the smooth operator. Absalom used to stand at some crossroads leading to the king's palace and let his hair grow long and talk to everybody who had a grievance that he hoped would be settled by the king. And he would say, well, you know, the king is probably not going to do anything, but if I was king, here's what I would do.
Sure. And we see some of that in this week's readings as well. David gets tricked a few times. Once by Amnon with the help of Jonadab, once by Absalom. David certainly didn't mean for Amnon to be murdered when he when Absalom asks him to come to you know, the place where his sheep shearers are.
Well, and I think Absalom just plots and plans and waited, right? We're told that it's 2 years later. He doesn't take his revenge right away.
Sure.
But I think he's thinking about it every day of those 2 years. He just seems to be that kind of person.
Yeah.
So, somewhat of a conniver.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like we said before, another smooth operator.
Mm-hmm. So David's been the smooth operator, and it seems now he's being smoothly operated against.
Yeah.
So, $1 million question. Where is God in all of this?
Well, we know from Nathan that God was prophesying that something like this would happen, that members of David's household would take up swords.
Sure.
I am going to leave.
Okay. See you, Gordon.
Church. Bye.
Thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Another question, sort of related to this. What is David's experience in all of this? I mean, this is speculative. We're not told too much about what he feels aside from, well, verse 21. David was very angry when he heard these things about Amnon and Tamar. What is he feeling throughout all of this stuff that happens with Absalom?
Well, he seems rather passive about everything. He's not very engaging. He could have gone with Absalom to the sheep shearers thing, and he didn't do it.
Yeah.
You know, and when after, you know, he found out about, you know, Amnon's you know, indiscretion, he kind of just let it ride. You know, he's not really engaged in it. He didn't seem like he was seeking God's you know, counsel or anything through all this.
Which comes back to what I said about David not disciplining his sons.
Okay, so I want to suggest as a final comment before we end our class that
David, how did he treat Solomon?
David,
Because he knew that Solomon would succeed.
Go ahead, say it, Mom.
Well, thinking about how David treated his sons, how did he treat Solomon? Because he knew that Solomon would succeed him. And he seemed to be concerned that Solomon would be a godly man.
Sure.
Maybe he has meditated on the previous mistakes.
Right. And now that he's on the receiving end of some of the very wrongs that he's committed, the very sorts of wrongs that he's committed, and the sorts of character flaws that he's demonstrated in earlier parts of the story, I want to suggest here that something is that there's something that's happening here in David. We don't see in this reading the end of it, because as some of you have mentioned, this thing with Absalom, it keeps going. There's going to be a coup that happens. All this stuff's going to happen. We're in the midst of it right now. But I want to suggest that David seems passive, but think about it from his perspective. He's experiencing all of these things, and as a man after God's own heart, he may very well be reflecting on these things, and these things may change David internally. So I want you to keep those things in mind for subsequent weeks. We'll see how things happen. Some of you are, of course, familiar with the story already, but for now, I want to close this in prayer so you can all get to church. Father, I want to thank you for your scriptures. I want to thank you for even the tough portions of scripture that cause us to wrestle with issues of sin and punishment and consequences, and wrestle with them even as the ancients did. Father, thank you for giving voice to our hard thoughts. Father, thank you for being a loving God with whom we can be honest. And Father, thank you again for your servant David, whose example and whose story we can use to better follow you. In your name, amen. Thank you all for attending. Sorry we went a few minutes over, but
thank you.
Thank you. Next week's readings, the narrative is 2 Samuel 15 through 18, verse 18. So I've divided up chapter 18 a little bit. So that's 2 Samuel 15 through 18, verse 18. The Psalms for next week are Psalms 3, 22, 31, 53, 63, and 143. Thanks, Paul, for putting those on the chat. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you again, everyone. Thanks, Paul, for hosting.